Hey, what's going on? This is episode 67 of Studio Practice. In the last 3 episodes, we dealt with analogical reasoning. The last episode dealt with something called the 4 master tropes of figurative language, and more specifically focusing on what I like to refer to as the productive gap between dissimilar elements, and how that is a primary mechanical structure in contemporary art and design, how we see that play out in sculpture, installation, graphic design, experimental graphic design, prints, poster work. It's a leitmotif that artists use, a structural and mechanical leitmotif that artists use over and over again. At the end of the last episode, I asked for comments and responses, the first of which that we're going to look at today is from the theatrical designer Conure O'Leary.
My name's Conure O'Leary. I'm a theatrical props artisan, which means I make props for theater. When you put out your first video on the analogical thinking process, I posted a comment asking about how it could be applied to my work.
What is the difference that comes from this type of analogical thinking compared to various drafts within one form? And moreover, do you believe that to think this way, one needs to physically create the object or gesture in different forms? Or can thinking about it alone accomplish the goal? Did you need to take the bust all the way to bronze to learn what was learned from it? Was creating it in wax or digitally in 3D space enough? I think what you say here makes a lot of sense. However, it's difficult for me to apply to my work primarily as a props artisan for theater, wherein I often don't have the time to think about pieces this way, but perhaps because my prop work is just a part of a larger gesture, this kind of thought might be more applicable to thinking about a theatrical presentation as the object and thinking about what is being presented by the whole piece analogically. To me, one of the most interesting and compelling and maybe even problematic aspects of Conure's initial question has to do with the issue of speed. Over the course of the past, 16 or 17 years, I've run a graduate program that primarily, not exclusively, but primarily draws to it graphic designers, people who were schooled as communication designers. Now, over the course of that time, of course, I've had people who have advanced degrees in economics or sculpture, painting, photography, but primarily graphic designers. And the speed issue that Conure raises with regard to making theatrical props is something that raises its ugly head over and over when dealing with designers, primarily graphic designers, but designers in general, who are attempting to make a kind of work that is positioned either in the contemporary art realm or in a kind of liminal space, a kind of space between or that overlaps both contemporary art and graphic design. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the traditional graphic design ethos is one of speed. Let's go back to 1985 for a moment, to a BBC program called Micro Live, to take a look at least some of the roots of the need for speed.
Next Tuesday sees the launch of Eddie Shah's new newspaper, Today, which he claims uses the most advanced printing technology in the world. This is a test copy. Both the pictures and the text are processed and assembled into pages entirely by computer. Well, it's now possible to do something similar on home micros. There are several packages available that will help you jazz up the tennis club news, perk up the parish magazine, or in our case, mutilate the microlive notes. For home publishing, you really need more than just a word processor. You need to be able to generate documents containing both.
The relationship between speed and aesthetics was fundamentally altered with the widespread adoption of the personal computer. In 1985, Aldus Corporation released the desktop publishing package PageMaker. Designers, specifically graphic designers, were at the leading edge of these changes.
It's got headlines, it's got columns, it's got pictures and diagrams and so on, and it's all very nicely laid out. It's rather clever, I think. Well, I'm in the process of writing our microlive program notes, and you can see I've got half a page here, and that's what's displayed on the screen. I can scroll it up and see the bottom half down here eventually as I go along and prepare things. Well, I'm just going to write a new column over here, and I position the cursor where I want to start typing, and just hit one of the keys on the mouse like that, and I can type home publishing.
The subtext of much mainstream design education has largely been about training for 2 things: speed and aesthetic latitude. That ability to create distinctly different aesthetic approaches to the same problem. A designer is required to churn through a tremendous amount of ideas, both aesthetics, in terms of aesthetics as well as concepts, in a quick period of time that's driven largely by economics. But when you're a graphic designer, it's as if the computer itself, the tool itself, the periscope of the LCD screen, and the tool itself fosters a kind of speed.
Here is a stereoscopic night vision periscope for a Soviet battle tank.
Since 1985, the traditionally trained designer primarily understands the real world through the narrow vista that is his or her computer screen. And it's this periscopic vision of reality that provides an almost wireframe understanding of the real. So why am I talking about it in these terms? What does a tank periscope and graphic designers or designers being trained in a kind of immaterial, in the immaterial world, in the world of the simulacra have to do with Conure's original question? Conure asked whether or not merely thinking through, doing an iterative, working through conceptual iterations, merely thinking through analogically the possible iterations of work is sufficient, and of course everyone's going to have their own opinion, but in my experience it's precisely how an object in its conception slips away from the perfection of the idea as that object installation or piece is being made. That's the issue. As that object is in the process of being made, it slides away from the perfection of the idea. So I personally don't believe that it is sufficient. It's enough to merely think through the various iterations of objects if the ultimate goal is not simply an idea. I think the instructional lesson with regard to graphic designers is how immaterial the understanding of the world becomes when its primary perspective is through the tank periscope, the periscope of the digital world, the digital world. It is the speed itself, the rapidity of making that creates in the object problems, that makes the object, makes the installation, makes the piece not work. And what do I mean by this? I mean that in other disciplines, in painting or fiber and textile or sculpture, there appears to be, at least at first blush, there appears to be more of a belief in the power, the power of material transformation, the transportative power of the object. So the way that an object looks on film or video or on screen, and the speed with which the object is made, have ramifications in the object itself. Now I know Conure is dealing with slightly different set of issues, but I do believe that the solution to the problem, both for designers who are positioning their work or who are interested in positioning their work, bringing into that work issues more germane to contemporary art space, or issues that push work beyond traditional design, as well as Conure, is the idea of a sustained inquiry, a materially based sustained inquiry, working with materials, working with the object and the craft of the object over time. It's my belief that the rapidity with which one works, the kind of hyperkinetic speed that's required of the designer, is counterproductive, is a problem in the discrete object.
It's kind of a strange question because when it comes to the work I do, it's both always of the same form and always or often of very different forms. I'm always making, or almost always making, a prop for theater, but that means that I'm working with lots of different kinds of materials, making different objects, whatever's required of the show, and that includes paintings, sculptures, graphic designs, all kinds of things. I think more importantly, I saw a block between this analogical thinking process and the work I do because I make whatever prop the show calls for and then I move on. I don't have the opportunity to iterate on an art object that I'm working on the way you talk about in that first analogical thinking video. However, when you started talking about bringing two distinct objects together and looking at them with figurative language and looking about how the gap between them brings them into a group as a whole, I started to realize there is a place inside my work that I do use this specific kind of thinking. Now, this part of my work isn't always a visual art piece, but it's what really gets me going. It's what makes me excited to keep working in props, and it's when I'm faced with a challenge to make a prop do something, move in some way, or create some kind of special effect. And I'm particularly excited when I first find out about this and I have absolutely no idea how I'm going to make it happen. Now first, I'm not completely sure how I do this, how I decide what actually it is that I'm going to do to accomplish the task. It isn't something that happens completely within that part of your mind that's an internal monologue where you figure things out step by step. Some amount of this decision process, this reasoning process happens in a part of my brain where I don't actually get to know what all the steps are. I think what's going on when I'm solving a problem this way is or has a lot to do with this type of analogical thinking that you're talking about in this video. It doesn't really matter what the movement that I'm trying to accomplish is. I think the way the thought process typically takes place is based on this massive catalog I have in my mind of just objects or systems that I've seen functioning in the world and the parts that make them function. I think I break these objects down into their parts that allow them to do what they do or allow them to do part of what they do, and I think about my end goal, what the object that I'm trying to create needs to be able to do. I take these different aspects of existing systems in my mind at first and then physically, and I bring them together and I try to see them as a whole functioning the way that I need them to. I think that when I'm doing this, I very quickly leap to see the whole of an object as really just one aspect of it, or one part that allows it to do it. You know, if you think about a standard click ballpoint pen, there are at least 3 distinct parts that are really important to its function. You know, there's obviously the part in the back of the pen that you press up and down with the button and it rotates the pen slightly forward and catches it up on a ledge so that it sticks out the front of the tube. When you click it again, it rotates forward again and lets the pen fall back into the tube. But that's not all that's going on. There's the spring in the front of the tube, and you might think that spring is just there to push the pen back when you don't want it out of there. But without that spring, without the compression that it puts on the click system the whole time, it wouldn't function. The pen wouldn't rotate forward properly, it wouldn't catch up, it would jam, or it wouldn't move right. And that's not all that's there. There's also that screw in the center of the pen where it comes apart into 2 pieces. If that wasn't there, you wouldn't be able to assemble the pen. You wouldn't be able to access the insides of the pen and work on it, repair it, or fill up the ink again. And each one of these things, each one aspect of an existing system could be one key to allow the prop that I'm trying to create to move the way I need it to move. And, you know, no matter what it is, I'm thinking about what needs to happen. I go, oh, like a pen. And I just say, like a pen, not like the spring in the front of a pen. So what I'm doing isn't using this analogical thinking to iterate on a piece of visual art, looking at it or learning about it in different forms, but instead what I'm doing is using that same analogical thinking or a similar analogical thinking surrounding already existing systems to iterate on them and understand how they work so they can be applied to create my art object the way that I need it to function.
So I also received an excellent question from Who Is This via the comments section on YouTube. Who Is This writes, in thinking further about the concept of analogical thinking and the concept of A equals B and how this artistic process should work, one thing that comes to mind, at least in thinking about the concept in a more literary sense, is the works of Wittgenstein and Derrida, and how a point of their work is how language cannot capture everything. And so a greater idea of this sort of harmony between A and B is shown by explaining within the work how they are not the same. A does not equal B. By virtue of this, the gap between A and B as similar concepts is done purely in the thinking of the reader, and therefore the writers can express the inexpressible. The same idea is carried in religious thought, in the works of St. Aquinas, and in The Cloud of Unknowing. With the line of thinking termed as apophatic, or negative theology, which supplants a similar line of thinking. I suppose my question is this, if this is in any sense lucid and understandable. Do you know any work, or have you experimented with work, which seeks to make the audience think something which purposely is not stated, misstated, or simply cannot be stated in the work? This, to my mind, calls to mind or foregrounds one of the fundamental philosophical aesthetic concepts of art, and that is the idea that one definition of art is that art is a form of extended or embodied cognition, that it is thinking itself through a different form and extended, pushed beyond the body, that art is effectively a calculator for causal reasoning. In other words, effective art, powerful and moving art, is not the same thing as writing an essay about the subject matter. It's not the same thing as verbally discussing the subject matter. It is in itself a form of cognition, a form of thinking, and could be manifest no other way. Further, in addition, that the viewer in the presence of the object mirrors, has a cognitive process that could be manifest in no other way as well. In other words, it's not the same thing. Really powerful works of art are not the same thing as writing an essay about the subject matter. And more specifically, it's important to point out that form of cognition, that form of thinking, could be manifest in no other way. Pete Vanneau, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right, provided excellent feedback, primarily from a writer's perspective, on a kind of the cautionary nature of relying, of how some writers lean a bit too heavily into what he referred to as analogical reasoning. As a writer, I have this big problem with analogical thinking where it can just descend into this really basic high school literary analysis one-to-one bullshit. A lazy substitution of one thing for another and hoping that the readers will somehow provide the hard work of making it seem insightful. A really dumb example is something like District 9, where aliens equal exploited minorities, and somehow the substitution is meant to provide an altered perspective that offers some exploration, but in reality, it says nothing new. Perhaps this example is tainted because it is, after all, the only solution I've found to that is combining various A's and condensing them into a singular analogical representation, B. For example, and I wish I could show my own work, but obviously I can't, is Moby Dick, where the sea and the whale can operate as analogies for the unconscious, femininity, or the wilderness, etc. Another thing, I think a lot of what you're saying here is even more relevant to literature because writers have to grapple with the substance of their work not being able to depend on superficial shortcuts or sensory gratification like artists or musicians can. Writers can't get away with making pretty books that say nothing, usually, or lack a deeper cohesion, which is, I suppose, a major flaw in a lot of the visual arts. Pete's comments are right on the money. My exhortation or my advice in that episode was specifically about taking charged imagery, two dissimilar terms, and bringing those two dissimilar terms, or three dissimilar terms, into physical proximity with one another. And I guess the area that I didn't emphasize enough was that there should not be, I don't believe that there should be a kind of formulaic relationship between the two. The District 9 paradigm that Pete refers to in his comments, obviously I think is problematic, and that's not the relationship that I'm referring to. I'm referring to the idea of taking dissimilar, two or a group of dissimilarly charged images. And by charged images, I mean images that the viewer, or elements that the viewer has a visceral, non-intellectualized response to, and bring them into physical proximity, or fuse them together in a way so they slide into one another, all with the explicit intent of having the viewer close that gap and make those relationships. So I guess the only thing that I'm referring to that's slightly different, and it may not even actually be slightly different than what Pete is referring to, is to not approach the creation, the construction of the figurative language in our work in a kind of formulaic way that's driven prior to the creation of that space, prior to the creation of the image, by a singular idea, to allow the manipulation, the physical manipulation of visual elements, of dissimilarly charged imagery, to create their own relationships. Nathan Lepofsky posed the powerful question of whether or not it could be productive to try to reconcile, to try to synthesize a kind of new terrain between irony and sincerity. I don't know what that would look like. I think the endeavor could produce interesting results, needless to say, and I think it's an interesting concept. And finally, in the last episode, we dealt with the four master tropes of figurative language. I felt like I gave kind of short shrift to the irony/pun component of the discussion. There are two different types of pun. There is the instantaneous pun and the sequential pun. Right now we're going to take a look at instantaneous pun, which relies on the idea that a single word or single image can simultaneously express two different concepts. So here is a pun that I've created for today. That's an instant pun. This is little known facts in hip hop. Andre Young, aka Dr. Dre, was originally Dr. Dre, Dr. Squirrel's Nest. Before founding Aftermath Records, he was studying rodentology at UCLA. It's great to make yourself laugh, right? Dre, definition, a squirrel's nest. So this is an example of instantaneous pun. And finally, I got a request from Stefan Rosger to produce an episode on the white V-neck t-shirt. Okay, so I purchase Hanes 100% cotton white beefy tees. No, that's not what they are. They're Hanes 100% cotton tees that come in a pack of about 12. And I wear them while they're new, and then the idea is, anyway, to throw them out the moment that they start getting yellowed or dirty, which happens quite frequently, quite quickly. They cost about $12 for a pack of 10 or 12 of them. My wife absolutely hates them. My partner, my buddy, Darlene, hates the white V-neck t-shirt. It's a classic. It's a great thing for summertime, and they're dirt cheap. If anyone has a suggestion for a higher quality white V-neck t-shirt, please sound off in the comments below. But again, the idea really is to buy a pack of them, to wear them for about a month, maybe 2 months, and then recycle them as rags and buy another pack. And that way they're always crisp and fresh and dope.